If you were living in one of these buildings, which one do you think, either would you want to live in, or which one do you think most accurately depicts where you live?
I would like to live in the White Houses. They
Okay.
seem bigger and nicer.
Okay.
The Red Houses depict where I live.
Husband and I live in Highland Park, and the White Houses look like some of the houses that are there. Our house was built in 1910, and it's a two-story house, and but ours is a neighborhood with lots of different houses, and people are trying very hard to not have them be torn down and replaced by ugly little cookie cutter houses.
I can see just some elements of urban white flight that you saw in Birmingham, which is my personal context during the Civil Rights Movement, where as immigration was forced upon the city of Birmingham, and you saw all the affluent white people retreating to the hills surrounding the area. And so that's what I see the White House is representing here. I can't help, since they're at the base of the mountain. And then I guess with Chattanooga, I'm near to the area, but I see it as Lookout Mountain or Signal Mountain. You know, those communities there kind of retreating away from the urban center. But you know, thankfully now Chattanooga's coming into a time where there's a greater appreciation for the urban center.
Think about this in context of your experiences either in Chattanooga or in other neighborhoods, ones you've grown up in.
Like Alton Park versus Lookout Mountain.
Okay, and what do you mean by that?
Just to me, it seems distressed in the foreground, and as people were pointing out, more affluent in the background, with especially with the mountains in the backdrop.
Yeah, to keep up with what he was saying, you used the word particularly distressed. And I didn't grow up in Chattanooga. I actually grew up in Jacksonville, Florida. And so maybe you can apply some of what I say to neighborhoods in the area. But Jacksonville grew so quickly that there were a lot of neighborhoods that had a lot of houses with families, you know, all different types of shapes and sizes of families. But then you'd go down one street and it was almost like the whole atmosphere changed.
As you guys said, there's a lot more going on downtown, so it's hard not to see it, the positive and the negative of that. And I know some of my students heard some statistics last week, and Elliot might be able to rattle some off. What do you guys know about some of the neighborhoods, the gentrifying neighborhoods? Does anyone from Chattanooga from a while back can remember, for example, what the South Side used to be like?
Just
Or
the change in names is stark. You know, it used to be North Chattanooga, now it's North Shore.
Okay.
South Side, that used to be just Main Street.
Or they're
Okay.
trying to do the same thing in Brainerd too.
Yeah.
Change it to Old Town.
Rebrand.
Newtown.
Yeah.
And I remember
Okay.
when
They're fighting.
North Chattanooga / North Shore didn't have anything except for a Subway and lunch business. I used to go to, City before it turned into Central Creek Park. So that was kind of interesting. Now you have condos and you've got all these artsy boutiques that are coming in, which is great, right? But I think it speaks to what you were saying about those no doors. Is that something that maybe people don't want to be inclusive?
Or maybe it means no access.
A lot of my friends that lived in North Chat, when it was still North Chat, had moved over to St. Elmo at the foot of Lookout Mountain, another mountain, because rent is more affordable there. I see that being the next.
And now that they've got the bike path going to St. Elmo, that's gonna go, I mean, that's the last
yeah.
connector, now that people can start riding it from St. Elmo.
Interesting part about that is St. Elmo used to be a very affluent neighborhood. Now it's not, and it's switching. Like gentrification, if you will, is almost like a flowing wave of just changing structures as people move around and moves around.
Because you could buy a house in North Shore 10 years ago for $20,000. Now you can't find one for $200,000. It feels like, especially with my experience, like the mountain being Signal Mountain, and then it's spilling off in toward Red Bank and North Chat. and then you see all this rebranding and moving all the artists and the musicians that used to live, $400 or $500 rent, to where you can't find a 2-bedroom for more than, $1,200. I mean, it's happened to me.
We bought a house in MLK in 2007, and that was when I used to live in South Korea and we moved here. And it was already a changing neighborhood at that point. There was not, there was no crime. It was actually it was a mixed neighborhood. But the UTC students, I found if their parents were from Chattanooga, they would tell their children or the students at UTC to not cross MLK. That was where, because it got too dangerous. So if you're at UTC, don't go over there, that's the bad neighborhood. And having lived on that side on 11th Street, I can tell you that, one time I accidentally left my keys in the door overnight, and nothing happened, for example. And in fact, I think there's a lot of other neighborhoods that have a lot more crime issues. But those are those things go back to a different time period. With the neighborhoods. And now that, as you said, and now apparently the person that bought Douglas House has bought up a lot of property around MLK for developing. And so it was kind of the same thing where it would be hard to buy a house there, unless you're willing to pay for some money. And that's just happened recently. Is that the South Side and MLK are two of the fastest gentrifying zip codes in America. And the South, both in the top 10, and I think the South Side is at number 1 or 2. Yeah, as far as how quickly it gentrified. And by that means the people that lived there were displaced and moved out. The composition in the South Side has changed very quickly. And so one of my questions is, and even looking at this because it does feel very empty, is when these really fast gentrifying neighborhoods, where did the people go who used to live there?
Well, a necessary element of gentrification is displacement.
Right.
That is, if you look up many definitions, will say that gentrification includes the displacement of populations that are already there, especially of minorities, especially of elderly people. So one of the indicators of gentrification is seeing a lot more white people in the neighborhood, seeing a lot more younger people in a neighborhood, seeing more affluent people in a neighborhood. All of those things are, in political science at least, we use those as indicators of gentrification.
It looks that way depending on where you start looking from. Highland Park is a good example of that. When Highland Park was originally built, that was where all the rich people lived. Those were great big houses with very, very wealthy people living there. And over the years, those people moved elsewhere and the neighborhood went into decline. The big old houses were divided up into teeny-weeny apartments or triplexes or duplexes. Our house had been a triplex at one time. And the composition of the neighborhood changed. Now it's changing again. I don't see it as somebody called it a wave. It's a wave. It's not it starts here and it ends here. It just changes. I don't see that as a wholly bad thing. I think it's, in fact, I think generally speaking, it's a good thing if you don't let it get completely out of hand.
Sure.
So what about East Ridge and Missionary Ridge?
Those are going to become the new Highland, like how Highland Park used to be. As the city centers are getting re-gentrified, it's causing the now displaced populations that were in the city centers to push outward, leaving them. The reason why it's such an issue is because it's leaving them from many of the elements like public transport, easy access, and it's pushing them out to where they don't have
deserts. Yeah.
Pockets of poverty.
There are always practices across the country in which gentrification, because it's not waves, it makes it sound as though it's just, a marginalized population chooses to leave, where it's a population that has capital, both cultural and economic, is forcing it upon the marginalized community. So take, for example, Chicago, Cabrini Green, which was the worst projects in the country throughout the 90s. One of the things that happened there was, it wasn't necessarily a city ordinance, but hallway lights weren't fixed. They weren't changing light bulbs. Running water was turned off, gas was turned off. And so residents were forced to leave. They were moved to Normal, Bloomington, Illinois, about 2-3 hours away, St. Louis, Missouri. And this is one way in which those projects were shut down. And the Gold Coast of Chicago, which is the most capital dense area of that city, expanded itself. And the primary reason was because from those condos, the top floor, they could see the gunfire at night. So I don't think it's easy enough to just say, they left, we came in, they left, and this is back and forth. There are specific practices that come from acts of power.
That sounds very familiar to kind of what's happening now, where they're tearing down of the projects and people have to leave, but there's no affordable housing anymore in the areas that they grew up in and the schools that their kids go to. So they're forced to move into another neighborhood where maybe they can't afford, again, the housing, and the schools are different. Now the schools are at a lower rate because that's the only thing they can afford. So it just sounds pretty much like what's happening now.
Calling it a wave kind of ignores that like capitalism has teeth. In order for people to have houses, like there have to be people who don't have houses. Like and in saying that it's a wave, it says that anything that is deemed valuable is up for sale, regardless of whether people live there, regardless of whether they have occupancy, and it only doesn't become valuable when like we don't want it anymore, or when the people who have the money and the influence to like put their feet down there don't want it anymore. And
That's the crest of the wave. Why, like, the gentrification is the crest. You have the rise and the fall. Naturally, that's why it's a wave.
The issue with it is that the driving force behind it is the rich people. If it was like they willingly moved out and it was all part of just this wave thing, it wouldn't be so bad. But it's that people are forced out of their home and they're displaced.
Forced is also terrible, and if most of them bought their homes, it's harder to be forced out if they're renters or anything like that.
So
it's the
important distinction.
It's the owner's
Right, and a
distinction.
lot of the lower income people rent, and that's why they're more easily forced out. That doesn't make it a good thing.
Yeah, it's like, it's a wave that becomes a flood.
Yeah.
So,
But it doesn't have to be that way. I would really like to not hear gunshots in my neighborhood, but I do. And I would really like it if people didn't slash the tires on the street, but last night we had a whole wave in a 6-block area around us of tire slashings. But I don't see that the way that you solve that problem is by chasing people out of the neighborhood. It's the lower income people in our neighborhood were just as victimized by the tire slashings, and they are just as victimized by the gunshots as anybody else in the neighborhood. Having a neighborhood that has a mixture, has people who has affordable housing and not so affordable housing, and where people connect with each other every day. I think that's the way you do. You make life better for everybody who lives in the neighborhood. And you don't do that by chasing out the people who have been there all along.
Something a lot of people haven't touched on here is they say that it's the rich people who are driving this. It's just the rich people. It's not entirely. It's also the government. This is the result of like deliberate policy choices that the people in power make. I can't speak exactly in Chattanooga just because I haven't worked in the political scene as much here, but this summer I did some housing work in Nashville. And I know that there were policies in Nashville where they would designate what they called a redevelopment district. And to do that, they had to designate somewhere as a blighted area. And what the guidelines for designating a blighted area are so broad, you could approach that anyway. And these weren't elected officials making the decisions. They were appointed bureaucrats, essentially, who were usually had ties to developers who stood to make money from it. And then what they do is they give loans, they're called TIF loans, which is tax increment financing, to developers, which is basically giving them money to develop spaces in these areas which are historically low income and historically, minority residents. And they drive up property prices, and they drive up the property taxes there, and they drive people out. And these are the results of government policy. It's not just something that kind of naturally occurs.